Here's the history of credit in under 5 minutes. So, in the old days, we're talking around a little over 400 years ago, which brings us to around the time of Galileo and the invention of the telescope. Back around this time in the early 1600s, there were companies founded in the Netherlands and in Britain called the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. So the Dutch East India Company was officially established March 20th, 1602, and is often officially considered the first truly multinational corporation, as it had investors and headquarters in several different countries. The British East India Company was founded 2 years earlier, in fact, in the year 1600, and was backed by the Queen, for crying out loud, the Queen of England. So these businesses were like the first of their kind, enormous enterprises doing business across the globe, traveling country to country by sea. And these companies were flourishing like nothing the world had ever seen, as they were establishing trade routes of that size and scale across the globe for the first time. The main product categories that were imported and exported were furs, cloth, and spices, and they were doing a lot of business. Extensive research determines that the Dutch East India Company was worth 78 million Dutch guilders at its peak. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to a whopping, ready for this? 7.9 trillion modern dollars. So, in perspective, Apple, which is currently the largest company in the world, has a value just barely north of $3 trillion. So their market cap is 3.02 trillion, just to be exact. To put it into clearer perspective, at its peak, the Dutch East India Company was worth more than Apple, Google, Amazon, Walmart, JP Morgan Chase, Ford, Chevy, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Johnson & Johnson combined, with more than 200 billion left over. That is nuts. This makes the Dutch East India Company the single most valuable company to ever exist in the history of the world. Okay, great. So, following the pioneering footsteps of global capitalism in the 16 and 1700s, and fast forward into the 1800s, and the world was ripe with businesses ranging from small mom and pop shops and local vendors all the way to these huge multinational corporations doing business all over the place. And it was through the steady evolution of a developing global trade network that deemed a consumer credit system necessary to be established. There were just simply too many moving parts now. So shopkeepers, grocers, tailors, and especially big business had a new problem of trying to weed out unreliable consumers and identify whom to actually trust and whom to invest in. For the first well-documented time in American history, consumer credit was incorporating itself into the very fabric of American life. So, the history of American consumer credit was not first created with the invention of credit cards or anything like that, but rather has a history that dates much further back. The first consumer credit bureaus actually popped up in the 1870s, with commercial credit reporting firms emerging as early as the 1840s. These credit reporting companies began to accumulate humongous archives of consumer financial data. The approach in the late 1800s and early 1900s was basically individuals and businesses going from merchant to merchant, taking notes about the people whom they had payment arrangements for goods and services purchased on credit. And these notes could say anything from simply like marking that the customer is reliable and always pays the debt, to even mentioning co-signers, such as family members who would cover the debt in case the original customer couldn't. So armed with these new scrupulous, personal, and detailed notes on consumer purchasing and payment trends, merchants were able to contact local credit reporters and use this to their advantage to obtain information they had about a person in their file. Over time and continuing into present day, these credit reporters managed to grow in scale and develop an incredibly detailed, incredibly enormous, incredibly vast, and perhaps most stunningly invisible security network that monitors you and basically tracks and records every single decision you make pertaining to your finances. So to quote Josh Lauer in his book Creditworthy, quote, "The Consumer Credit Bureau was a vital information infrastructure upon which American consumer capitalism was built," end quote. Today, the three primary credit bureaus, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, rest amongst the most powerful institutions in our country. Yet most of us know virtually nothing about them. Interesting, huh?